Top diplomats from China and the United States meet in Washington to discuss how to solve the DPRK nuclear issue. The Russian Navy launches missile strikes at ISIL targets in Syria as tensions escalate between Moscow and Washington. And US President Donald Trump questions the neutrality of Robert Mueller, who is investigating alleged Russian interference in the US election. We'll talk about these stories and more. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Both China and the United States want a Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons, but it's a lofty goal that remains for now out of reach. Top officials from both countries met in Washington this week to discuss the DPRK and other security issues. For more analysis, joining us now from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He's a political analyst for China Radio International. Here with us in the studio is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. From Manchester, England, we're joined by Mohammed Shafiq. He's the chief executive of the Ramadhan Foundation. And Lester Munson is the vice president with BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Qinduo, let me start with you. And as I mentioned, these talks have been taking place between the between China and the United States on the nuclear program being conducted by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. These talks have been ongoing. The latest talks have been part of the strategic dialogue between the United States and China. What's been achieved so far?
Well, if you look at the official statement released by the Chinese side, both countries reaffirmed their commitment to achieving a complete, verifiable, and irreversible goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. If you take a look at the three words, complete, verifiable, and irreversible, these words used to be the official rhetoric of the U.S. side. And now the Chinese side is adopting these exact words as the U.S. does. So this shows like there's a hardening position from the Chinese side. I expect the Chinese side will, apply more pressure on the North Korean side, will, more strictly scrutinize any business bodies that have any kind of relationship or trade or business relationship with North Korean side. They will be put under stricter scrutiny. Okay,
Qinduo, I want to stay with you because after that meeting, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson made a statement. Let's listen to what he said, and then I want you to listen to the response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zheng Shuang. Let's watch.
We reiterated to China that they have a diplomatic responsibility to exert much greater economic and diplomatic pressure on the regime if they want to prevent further escalation in the region.
When the world says that it hopes China can do even more, I don't know what do even more refers to. We've said many times that China is making unremitting efforts to resolve the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and plays an active and constructive role. However, the key to solving the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue is not just on China's side. We hope all parties will make their own efforts and shoulder their own responsibilities.
So, Qinduo, here we have the Chinese spokesman there saying that China is doing all it can to resolve this situation on the Korean Peninsula. What else can China do? What are the options?
Well, first of all, obviously, both China and the U.S., they share the common goal. That is like Korean Peninsula that is free from nuclear weapons. So, that's been said officially by Tillerson as well as James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. The end state remain the same. So this is very helpful. And secondly, I think there's expectation on the Chinese side, somehow as long as China applies enough pressure on North Korean side, and then Pyongyang will give up its nuclear weapons. I think that expectation is better out of touch with reality. It's unrealistic, to be frank. Remember, the key problem on the Korean Peninsula is between Pyongyang and Washington, between North Korea and South Korea. It's not between North Korea and China. Yes, China can play a very critical role in solving this problem, and it is doing that. But there's a limit of how much further China can do, how much further China can go in terms of applying pressure on North Korea. Frankly speaking, from the Chinese side, even if China cut off the complete relationship with North Korea, trade and the diplomatic relationship, North Korea will continue to have nuclear weapons, continue to develop nuclear weapons, because their real concern, ultimate concern is about whether there will be a military strike from the U.S. side, whether the U.S. will engineer a regime change on North Korea. That's their real concern.
Simon, we also learned this week of the death of the American student Otto Warmbier. He had been detained for a year in the DPRK. An official in Pyongyang denied that he'd been mistreated or that he'd been tortured. That official in Pyongyang accused the United States and South Korea of a smear campaign. Do we know what happened here?
No, we don't know what happened. I mean, we know that the North Koreans claim that he suffered a case of botulism, that he then took a sleeping pill from which he never woke up. We know that fast forward 17 months and he's being returned in dreadful medical condition to the United States. And we know that his death in Cincinnati, just a matter of days after he returned to US soil, definitely hardened attitudes inside the White House and specifically inside the Oval Office about North Korea and about the role that China can play therein. So you saw President Trump before that meeting this week here in Washington seeming to suggest that he was very thankful to the Chinese government for having put fresh pressure on Kim Jong-un, but concluding that that pressure on the DPRK was not working, and he inferred that there was a possibility that the United States would now go it alone against the DPRK. That hasn't happened. You didn't see during the course of this meeting fresh sanctions being announced by the United States against the DPRK. So it would seem that Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, may have succeeded in saying to the president, let's give this a little bit more time. But there's no question that the Otto Warmbier case has definitely shocked Americans and hardened attitudes.
Lester, as Simon says, hardened attitudes inside the White House. There are still Americans being held in the DPRK. There's a Canadian being held there as well as South Koreans being held there. What does the United States do under these circumstances? I mean, they're also dealing with the other big issue, which is nuclear weapons.
Right. I think this is a real test for the Trump administration. There's a lot of issues here. They've got the Chinese in town. They're having these discussions about North Korea. There are other issues between the United States and China, the South China Sea. There are economic and trade issues that have been left off the table while this is going on. The administration has to show it can balance all of those things. They've moved, which, by the way, I think this is a good thing. The U.S. administration, the Trump administration, has moved to a much more normal relationship with China. There's no longer talk of Taiwan and throwing out the one China policy. We've moved to a much more normal state of affairs, but he's got to show, President Trump has got to show he can get some stuff done. Yes, Americans are very upset about what happened with the young student in North Korea, as they should be, but at the same time, President Trump has to show he can advance U.S. interests vis-a-vis China in a very difficult environment. This is a real test for him.
Okay, let's move on to Syria. Let's bring in Mohammed from Manchester. It looks like the conflict there, Mohammed, seems to have morphed into a bit of a turf war right now between the United States and Russia. We also have Iran entering the conflict. It's fired missiles at ISIS targets inside Syria. We heard that 500 civilians have been killed in US-led strikes. Has this war, a tragic and terrible war as it stands right now, just got a lot worse?
Yes, it has. I mean, it's become a political football for various world powers, whether it's the Iranians and the Russians on one side or the Americans and the Saudis on the other side, along with Turkey. It's become a international game, if you like. And people have forgot that there are innocent civilians across Syria who have been brutally oppressed by their government, in this terms the Assad regime, dramatically oppressed by the barbaric ISIS, so-called Islamic State. And the world has stood by and watched this happen. Chemical weapons being used time and time again. You know, genuinely sickening scenes day after day has become a normal occurrence. And I just think the international community has failed in its ultimate objective, which is to safeguard human life. And in that, I think it shames the whole world that we can carry on with our lives without reflecting about what could have been done to save the hundreds of thousands of people who've been killed.
Lester, we know that the United States is already involved in this war in Syria, but are we about to see a major expansion of the United States involvement in that war, what sometimes is called mission creep?
I think there is a little bit of mission creep going on. President Trump has tried to show that he's different than President Obama. He's tried to amp up the rules of engagement for American military fighters. He's done that. He's added some boots on the ground to the battlefield, but it really isn't a substantive change from what we've seen in the last administration. So I don't expect that there will be a dramatic expansion of the war, at least from the U.S. side. I don't think President Trump has any intention to send in 10,000 new troops or a whole, Marine Corps regiment to change things on the ground. He's going to try and look like he's got a different policy than President Obama, but at the end of the day, it's still a very modest U.S. presence in Syria.
And there's no real sense here, I think, that public opinion is in any way kind of pressuring the White House to focus on this or pressuring the White House to simplify and come up with a more cogent message. Taking on board everything Mohammed was saying about the horrific civilian loss of life, this was also a week that saw an unbelievably dramatic moment with the blowing up of the Al-Nouri Mosque in Mosul by Islamic State, as they were basically, one of their final acts in the city. An absolutely astonishing piece of devastation of a glorious piece of architecture that had dominated that city's skyline for 800 years. And I don't think anybody in the United States really noticed.
How concerned should we be, Simon, the fact that Russia has actually cut off the so-called hotline between Moscow and Washington so that the two sides won't shoot at each other?
Well, I think we should be concerned about it because this is a very, very unstable environment in which everybody is operating. You have a situation where the Russians and the United States are not on the same side. The Russians are very, very clearly buttressing Bashar al-Assad. The Trump administration doesn't have very much to say anymore about Bashar al-Assad's future in power, not since President Trump became briefly but very animated over the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime. And you've got Iran in the mix. So this is an unbelievably complicated and dangerous tinderbox, and without those channels of communication, things can very, very rapidly escalate and go wrong.
All right, Mohammed, you mentioned a moment ago that you'd like to see more international involvement in this conflict in Syria. What kind of involvement would you like to see?
Well, can I just pick up the point about the mosque? If there's any doubt that ISIS are enemies of Islam and Muslims, then their blowing up of that mosque in Mosul is the nail in the coffin. That somehow that these people are acting in the name of Islam. They're enemies of Islam. They're enemies of Muslims around the world. That such a sacred place like a mosque can be blown up without any regard for the historical context, but also the religious significance of that building. I've always argued that I don't support Western intervention in Syria. I think it's a process that should involve the Muslim Arab countries. You saw this week, for example, Emmanuel Macron, the new French president, for example, changed French policy on this by saying they're not longer in favor of deposing Assad in that negotiations. I think there has to be a political settlement, and that's got to be driven by the actors on the ground within Syria. There is no military solution here, and if we can just get the sides together in some positive way, and as President Macron said, it's a red line for him. If President Assad and his regime use chemical weapons again, then he's prepared to take action, whether multilaterally with partners. But if that doesn't happen, he said he's prepared to take action on his own as France. So, the atmosphere now is 6 years on, 400,000 people being killed, millions being displaced, and the world really needs to say enough is enough. Let's get this sorted.
Right, and I guess the problem, Mohammed, is if Assad goes, who replaces him?
Well, I think that was one of the criticisms President Macron was making. Show me the alternative. And I think that's been part of the problem because the opposition groups have been so fragmented and divided that you don't have a single figure or a group of people who you could say could take on that role of a incoming, multi-party interim government. And I think that's the problem. We've spent a lot of money weaponizing this war and giving military support to groups within Syria, but we've not thought talked about the day after. And this is systematic, if I may say, about American foreign policy over the decades. They're very good at immediate military strikes and military action, but absolutely hopeless when it comes to rebuilding countries and having a plan. And if you look at Libya, you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you see that in action as a testament to their failure to plan for the future.
Right, Qinduo, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been in Jordan in the Middle East. He's been holding discussions there. Let's take a listen to part of what he had to say.
The Middle East is the biggest barrel bomb in the world. If the Middle East is not stable, peace and stability will not be achieved in the world. The continuous crisis in the Middle East has harmed the nations in the region and impacted the world's peace and development. We sincerely hope the Middle East can return to peace and stability as soon as possible.
So, Qinduo, we have China, and China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. It's also helped Syrian refugees. Can China bring anything to this conflict, to the negotiations?
Well, by not taking sides with any particular party, I think China is already contributing, in a sense, to the peace and stability. There's lacking, actually, in the region. So there's also the view from Foreign Minister Wang Yi that China, maintained a good relationship with both the Arab countries and also the Iranians, both the Syrian government and also some of the rebel forces. So China is not sending weapons, or China is not supporting any particular side against another side, because from the Chinese point of view, that's not helpful to the peace and stability. Remember, China is launching its Belt and Road Initiative, which will involve many countries in this region. So peace and stability is not only rhetoric, but also very substantial to the Chinese side. China would be the country who hates to see the ongoing instability and ongoing warfare within, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. But also, this is political rift and also the tension within the Gulf countries. This is a pretty, I would say, troublesome, disturbing to the Chinese side.